Hi, I'm Paul Logan. You may know me from my other work, such as Appies or OAuth 2 Electric Boogaloo. But today, I'm here to talk to you about how we put search on api.slack.com. I work at Slack as a developer content systems specialist, and my full name is Paul Jeremy Frank Logan. So I guess it fits that my title would have way too much going on as well. What I do at Slack is pretty simple. I code the backend of api.slack.com. That's our source for everything that is anything documentation at Slack. Now, you may be wondering why we need an entire person to run Jekyll commands. The thing is that we don't use Jekyll, or Hugo, or Sphinx, or Git Pages, or StaticGen, or MKDocs, or Postman, or, well, you get the picture. We use a homegrown content system. My boss, Taylor Singletary, was an early employee on Slack's platform team back in the day, 2015, and one of the first employees on its developer relations team. He built api.slack.com from a loose collection of markdown files and relied on the infrastructure that backed Slack as a product itself. He did it so well, in fact, that in 2016 there were, ironically, articles citing it as an example of good documentation, like in 18 software documentation tools that do the hard work for you. api.slack.com is much beloved by some and scorned by others. We get a lot of feedback on many different channels. For years, there was a single most requested feature. The elephant in the chat room. Search. You see, people had gotten pretty used to Googling Slack, API, blah, 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 to find specific documentation. The thing about Google is that it's as good of a tool as it is, it's not going to work with you to make sure that the stuff that should show up on a search will. This is one of the reasons that we spent years trying to kill off incoming webhooks as a feature by builders. Traffic drove traffic, and Google kept sending people where we didn't want them to go. So how do I come into the story? Well, 4 years down the road, Taylor had a lot more responsibilities than just programming a website. And adding search to what was now a 4-year-old homegrown documentation system is no small task. Oh, did I mention the site is programmed in PHP? It's programmed in PHP. It's strictly typed offspring though. Hack. In comes Paul Jeremy Frank Logan, developer content systems specialist. I do a lot more around the house than just search for things, but this was the big project that I was hired to do. So I have a special affinity for it. There are 2 stories about search, and I'm going to tell you both. One of them is social, and one is technical. The social story is about how we made search on api.slack.com an experience that yielded great returns for both us as writers and maintainers of documentation, but also our users as consumers of it. It involves steering people away from outmoded docs that are only still relevant to 5% of the population. It involves tracking search trends and using them to better understand our readers. It involves writing hundreds of new tagline summaries for articles to convey quick understanding without losing our voice as a site as a whole. And there's a reason I bring up voice. It's extremely important to us as the team that makes api.slack.com, and it drove many of our decisions, both social and technical. The technical story is a little more cut and dry. It's one about the pitfalls and trade-offs of using a homegrown content management system and the flexibility and control that comes from using that system. One of which is that it leads to a guy with four first names and a 4-word title talking about this in a talk 5 years later. It's a story about doing anything technical in an ever larger enterprise organization. Be that writing or developing, it's about finding the right tool for a job, finding out that it's not perfect, and making the best of the situation. Anyway. Along the way, I'll tell you the lessons I learned about building and owning documentation. I hope that my story is one that you can take back to your own work and use it to reflect on the larger context of how you're serving up information to your readers. So let's look at how it all began. Before search at Slack, even internally, people used Google to find our documentation. I want to stop here to talk about internal and external docs. At Slack, we maintain a variety of documentation for differing levels, from unauthenticated users accessing whatever, to partners looking at specific partner docs, to internal developers looking at things that are classified. Those partner-only and internal docs, not indexed by Google. When you're thinking about enterprise, this is a big deal for any sort of partner engineering effort, as well as just for day-to-day. How does that thing that I built work? I mention this because I think it can be easy to forget that we aren't just making docs for general consumption. Oftentimes, some of the heaviest consumers are sitting right behind you. So, before search, we had Google. And Google had only public-facing documentation. And we didn't have good search statistics on what people were looking for, and Google still does this. The third and fourth results on this page, which is a search for Slack webhooks, are both legacy documentation that we warn people against. If you look at our incoming webhooks page, that's fourth on this page, we strongly warn people. We are active in warding new users away from these pages once they're on them, but they have to be on them first. So Google still directs a fair amount of traffic to pages that immediately tell people not to use them, which is a really frustrating user experience. Here's what the same search looks like on our site now. I'm not going to make the assertion that more visual complexity indicates easier use. However, in our eyes, this is an obvious improvement. Among other things, we're able to clearly ward people away from things we don't recommend while noting what type of page awaits the user on the other side of a link. In addition, we can deprioritize results on a per item basis so that people aren't walking through cobwebs. I'm not trying to badmouth Google. They still do a lot of cool stuff. For example, now that search is set up on our site, Chrome has automatically started to let you use our site search from the address bar. But search took months to get to a level where things were this organized. I've already told you about our custom CMS, but I want to highlight two things. One, again, that it's written in Hack, which is improved PHP, and two, that it's wired into the same monolithic code base as Slack itself. These things are important as to why we did what we did, and I'll come back to them soon. The custom nature of the system and the fact that it was 5 years old meant that we had a lot of different types of articles floating around. Tutorials, reference pages, API documentation of all shapes and sizes, from events to scopes to methods to object types. Most of that had been implemented on an as-needed basis over the years. And a lot of things were slightly different from each other. Before we could think about indexing and searching all of those things, we had to turn them into a uniform catalog. That meant deciding on one metadata shape that any piece of information floating around api.slack.com should have. As you imagine, it's a mouthful. Although this took almost as much time as the implementation process of search itself, it was a big project that continues to yield dividends for us. The docs themselves are better structured and easier to pick up and work with without in-depth technical knowledge of our system. It also set up for future projects of similar natures, like introducing code samples to pages or recording feedback. When it came time to search the client, there were two decisions we needed to make. Did we want to build it ourselves or buy a service to do it for us? And do we want to host it with everything else in the monolith? Or do we want to build it on an external server and let it exist outside of that zone? I think we always had a vague sense that we wanted to pay for a search provider. Building and maintaining a site search that would support tens of thousands of queries a day with just 2 people didn't sound nearly as appealing as just paying someone who already had it to let us use it. Eventually, we chose Algolia as our search provider. To quote Taylor, there were a couple of Solar as a service kind of providers out there, but it was clear Algolia offered the most control and seemed the most well suited for the type of content we had. Initially, Algolia seemed too good to be true. They have a product called Instant Search that seemed ready to go out of the box. Just upload your index, set a few API keys, and put the search widget on your site in almost any language under the sun. Great! Work completed. Everyone can head home early. Thanks for listening to my talk. Psych! Instant Search in all its forms has way too many dependencies and was therefore too big a security risk to bring into the monolithic Slack codebase. Even the low-code options used content distribution networks to get resources from off-site in order to function, which would have made us dependent on them. Great. Here's where it really matters that we're wrapped up in the larger enterprise. We can't be as scrappy as a small organization. But we thought maybe if we couldn't bring people to us, we could send them to it. And this was probably my favorite part of the project. I spent about a week spinning up an independent server for us to host Instant Search on, so that we could just accept traffic at api.slack.com and port searches off-site to our little no-rules haven. Great! It looked like it was going to work. Until someone poked their head in and noted that we just updated our security policy. Any traffic that comes to the monolith stays on the monolith. Great. So there we were, working on search, just an inch out of grasp, and we were almost at deadline. We had to make it work on the monolith, and work with Algolia. Well, Algolia has a ton of clients, libraries, frameworks. All of those must use an API, right? Well, why can't we just use that API? Here's Algolia telling us why we can't just use that API. Algolia is sure to note that usage of the REST API without an API client is not directly covered by the REST LA. Say what you will about them, but the REST API is one of the first things that pops up when you search on their site. Okay, so screw what I said just a second ago about being scrappy earlier. We were going to get scrappy. So we decided we were going to build this in Hack, in PHP, and we were just going to call the Algolia API directly. It's intentionally simple, so as not to be distracting, and we like it that way. It just has its own separate search page. After we finished bare bones search and had it finally working on api.slack.com, we added features like filtering by article type, pagination, and tracking to tell when our API requests weren't happening, and then later root out malicious clients looking for vulnerabilities. I think the most important lesson here is that we let our goals for search as a feature come from a place of cohesion with the rest of the site. We wanted our documentation to be read, not rifled through. We made the search experience a full-page takeover and decided that type ahead wasn't in the spirit of the site. We want to encourage deeper familiarity as opposed to quick answers. And this is probably the largest way in which our dedication to consistent voice on api.slack.com affected the development of search as a feature. We have a simple page that isn't using a bunch of JavaScript to throw everything at you as fast as you can type. At this point, we focus more on the social side of the story, with one marked exception: malicious use. The second our search bar was available to the public, as it is, people were trying to break it and hack it. Some of those people happen to be people we pay to do that, but still, it was a lot of noise. There weren't any legitimate vulnerabilities to important parts of our site or data. We tested it a lot, but it was drowning out the actual signal from genuine users. Earlier on, I had added logging to code that processes and sends the request to Algolia. It was right before we had our first internal trial, just to not break things and see what was happening. And we identified this subset of user agents using that code to see who was causing the trouble. And it was just a specific subset of agents. So we blocked them. Mostly it just came down to saying that if you had a Python client, you're going to get a blank page when you request something from a search. Because who is browsing API documentation with Python clients? After that, the attack slowed, and the noise was nearly completely filtered out of our analytics. And that's mostly the story of how everything was built. We got told no a lot, and as a result, the product is something that feels at home in api.slack.com. We were forced to take our time, not cut any corners, and we really benefited from it. Here's where the social story picks up. One of the biggest hurdles to making sure that search is useful is that it has context for the information that it shows. We initially tried to solve this problem by showing where the term is in the document and what's around it. That had middling success. It was really helpful for people who already knew the documentation and had existing platform familiarity, but it left new users in the dark. The solution to providing relevant context came in the form of heavy lifting. Copy for each and every search result. To further give api.slack.com that earthy feel, Taylor wrote taglines for each of over 800 individual pieces of documentation. They were informative, fun, and had the appropriate level of corny jokes. This did, however, require intimate knowledge of everything on our platform, which tells you what a wizard Taylor is. Some of the good taglines are, for docs presence and status, learn how to sync status with calendars, cubicles, and conference calls, and bathroom stalls. For start planning, measure twice and make each deploy quite nice. An overview for planning out your Slack app. And for docs/Slack status, Slack mostly works. How is Slack doing today? After introducing taglines to all of the documentation, all of our content, we finally shipped out our first version. At this point, we were ready to start having the users tell us stories of their own. Algolia provides good reporting on search volume, popular queries, queries with no results, etc. And that gained us some really, really good insights. A good example of this is some of the most popular searches that we had were people coming and searching for apps in Slack. That lives in a different part of the site entirely, in our app directory. One huge benefit of being in the monolith, however, was that we were able to go and use the app directory search function and port it right into our website. So now when people search for apps, we can present lists of things that they might have been looking for as a secondary result. And in the early days of search, we were able to see where users were landing based on search terms. I discussed the case earlier of our incoming webhooks and legacy documentation at the beginning of the talk, but that's just one of the examples where we were able to see the flow of search traffic and redirect it to where we want it to go. Having this level of control over your site really helps when it comes to putting certain painful practices to bed and also bringing awesome new ones to life. And it's probably the strongest argument I could make for taking search into your own hands. In another case, we saw early internal users adding qualifiers like tutorial or method to searches to narrow results. In response, we added filtering by type and topic. Pretty standard. While we displayed the result type from the beginning, we altered the CSS to make different types show up as different colors. The preference for basic visual indication as a way of conveying information about results has made scanning search pages much easier. As you saw in the presentation, we extended this practice to include graying out and adding warning icons to out-of-date documentation. Not only did we use the data directly from the search queries, but we also wanted to be intelligent and think about how people were interacting with search off the bat. So we did some experiments with our homepage and played with where we wanted to place the search bar. As you can see here, the search bar is both in the top banner and in a smaller section on the front of the homepage. There are a lot of different experiments that we're thinking about doing with this, but as we move forward with search, it's fun to sort of play around and see where it can go, what different places it would really fit. This is also another example of why it's good to be on the monolith Slack infrastructure, because we can take advantage of an existing experimentation system to gather data and make our own project better. I want to call out that all of this was made infinitely easier by reforming the way we kept metadata in a unified catalog. As a result, no matter the type of the document, we can always expect to know a base set of details when we go to display a result, which makes doing cool things with the way that results show up very easy. However, I don't want to make it seem like this custom solution was all daisies. I mean, first off, they had to hire me. And I've alluded to some complications earlier, but setting off on our own created a lot of upkeep work. And now we need to test every new type of document or addition to the site that might intersect with search, in addition to all the tests we built the first time we built it. A good example of this is what happened when we added our feedback component to search on the site. The feedback component was just a little widget that allowed you to say whether or not you liked a page and submit some written feedback about it. Big surprise, I built things similarly. So search also used URL parameters. Remember how I talked about malicious attacks and people trying to hack us earlier? Well, it is something we stay vigilant for, so we have bug hunters that are actually going through the site looking for vulnerabilities. And not soon after I posted this, I got a ticket saying that because of the 2 parameters in use, there was actually a vulnerability that had been created where someone might be able to send a false site, like a false version of our site, to another party and get some info off of them. It was, of course, an edge case and likely to never happen, but it's something that I never would have predicted, and just another way in which search did add overhead to maintaining our site. It had everything had previously been built in layers, so now search kind of cut through everything like a vein of ore. Every time we build something new or cool, we have to ask, should this be in search results? Would it be helpful? Would it be distracting? A good example of this was our recently added code samples system. It allowed us to index code samples, and it would have been helpful for some, but it was enough work that it kind of offset itself. There are more important things to focus on, and there always will be. For all its glory, the catalog requires upkeep. Right now, we do that manually, with a little help from a reminder bot in one of our channels. I'm currently in the process of building a service that is on a server outside of the monolith to do that job for us, to make everything a little bit easier, among other things. There's always more work to do, but I don't need to tell that to a group of documentation writers. One of the drawbacks of going off on our own with the Algolate API was that we don't get as much granularity as we otherwise would have from using one of their out-of-the-box solutions. You can see here that although we're getting general info on search, we'd have to put a lot more development hours in to getting super granular information like click tracking. We are constantly looking to make the site better. For search, much of that came in the form of anticipating our users and making them feel heard and anticipated. For all its drawbacks, there's still so much search has to offer us. And one of the things I'm most excited about is indexing that internal documentation that I talked about earlier to really give back to the people who helped us do all of this. Something that would be probably impossible to do without Google, actually, but doesn't seem so far of a stretch of the imagination for us anymore. To wrap all of this up in a neat little package for us, I'll just tell you what we talked about. API.slack.com needed site search. People were relying on uncontrolled results from Google. To get that site search, we went on a technical journey to find it, and we got told no a lot along the way. There were equal non-technical considerations, such as using data to inform how we were shaping our documentation site and visually indicating important information to users as they searched. Now we have search, and it makes everyone's lives easier. Thank you for coming to my talk. I've been Paul Logan. My Twitter handle is @ScottishKilt. I work for Slack, obviously, and if you have any questions, please tweet at me there, or I should be around in the comments after this. Thank you. Bye.
Hello, Paul.
Hi, how's it going?
Pretty good. Are you in San Francisco?
I am in San Francisco.
Oh my goodness. I thought I recognized the street from Full House in your video.
That was it.
Oh my goodness. I think people might have some questions about the tree. And I will now mention, if anybody here has got any more questions for Paul, please go ahead and post them into our session chat here, and we can both see them, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. We had a general question from Courtney a little while back. She was generally curious about your background, how you got to Slack, where you worked before, how you got into this field in general.
Yeah, so I graduated with a degree in computer science from Indiana University in 2016. From there, I worked as a Salesforce developer at a consulting company called Silverline in New York for a few years. And then I've always had a lifelong passion for writing and speaking. So I decided to sort of make the jump into developer relations. I started doing DevRel at Postman in 2018 and was there for about a year and a half before moving over to Slack and starting work developing the backend for Slack, api.slack.com.
Very cool. I think Courtney was also curious about any certifications you might have. And I know a lot of people come to software and to technical writing from a lot of unconventional backgrounds, and some come without formal education, some do. Anything you want to add there?
Nothing I would say is needed that's needed specifically. I am a Google Cloud certified developer, but that's not something I really use in my day-to-day job.
That's definitely like a huge topic that we can take elsewhere, because anyway, I won't go there, but I do have thoughts and questions about that in general. Going back to some of the questions that people have been asking in the stage or the session chat, Susan is asking about primary users, about whether they're Slack developers, or maybe is this a reference to internal docs or external docs? I couldn't tell.
I'm guessing it's just a reference to api.slack.com.
Okay.
Yeah, our primary users are all Slack users, basically, are all Slack developers. Pretty much, if you're on api.slack.com, you're there to build an app, build a bot, or perform some sort of integration, and so you're needing to use your API. So yeah, I will say in light of internal versus external, we have pretty much like three grades of there are people who are general public users, as well as we have some APIs that are available only to partners, and then some APIs that are available only internally, or some basically. So those are all audiences that we are writing for and catering to.
I think my brain burped a little bit. Going on with a question from Robert, did you consider using something like Elasticsearch instead of using the unsupported Algolia API? And if so, what factored into the decision to stick with Algolia?
Yeah, so we looked at several different search providers. The problem with most of the out-of-the-box search results, or basically search functions that we found, is that they did require a lot of dependencies. Once we sort of figured out where we were at with instant search, and that it wouldn't work, because that was about halfway into the project. We had already signed a contract with Algolia, and also Algolia, I think, was in terms of the way that they handle search results and the way that they are able to sort of digest and present information back to you so you can really understand your users, those were really strong points that we didn't want to move away from. And the decision to use the API ultimately came from the technical constraints that came from being part of this larger monolith within Slack. So it ultimately, in a funny way, it really was sort of a security thing that led us to use this API. And we haven't really had any problems with uptime. We haven't really had any problems with that API at all. I think there are a lot of things that Algolia stands to gain by not supporting that API and instead preferring people to go through any of their libraries or instant search or components. They definitely I think they definitely got a lot of data through there, and also they would probably generate several, an order of magnitude greater in terms of the number of API calls, due to the fact that instant search does have type ahead. So really using that API at a base just gave us so much control and allowed us to finally craft and to an exact nature, like design exactly what we wanted search to be, which was like a simple full page takeover experience.
I'm going to pause my thought and go to a question from Colby, which he did post to the session chat here. Colby's asking if you had any thoughts during your journey to use a web crawler service to crawl the site.
I wouldn't say we ever did. Yeah. So basically, one of the things I talked about was assembling all of the different documentation into a catalog. So that is sort of like a sitemap, right? In order for Algolia to work as a search provider, you need to give them a sitemap so that they can crawl over that and do that indexing. So compiling all of that really left us at a spot where it wasn't super necessary to do anything like implement a crawler as well, because we are regularly compiling a catalog that is the sum total of all of the pages on our site, and then sending that off to Algolia. So the space for a crawler there was taken up by the custom work we did to build that catalog.
Before I get to Eric's question, I want to keep encouraging people to post. We've got another one from Logan kind of queued out there, because tons of people are facing the same problem with search, and this is an excellent opportunity to have some real-time discussion. So Eric's question, Eric is saying, I'd love to hear more about the process of creating the schema for all documents. It sounds like it was fun.
Yeah, so I sort of alluded to that in the talk, that it's very sedimentary how sort of when initially just like basic article types, and I'm speaking a little bit for my boss Taylor here, who was there from 4.1, but over time, right, you add different types of documentation, right, from tutorials to methods to like best practices. And all of those, the way that you're storing them, if you're not like from a base doing, if you don't have from base have that centralized unified document format, they'll differ slightly. Like everything needs a title, everything needs like a subtitle, everything needs like some form of description and like potentially like related content. But when it comes to going back through time, sort of digging through all those layers and being able to unify them, it meant that within the way that we had defined all of those different types, all of them had certain things that were required. So like in order to save a tutorial, you needed to have like a title, a date, an author, and like related content, I believe. And I'm sure there's some stuff I'm forgetting, but which is very different than like in order to save an article, like you might not have needed an author. Because of that, it was like this big constraint problem where we had to have the ultimate data type, the ultimate sort of grand schema, include all of those required fields from I'd say like 6 or 7 different object types that like internal metadata types that we were sort of rolling into the catalog. In addition to that, we have what we refer to in the code as like an internal metadata structure and like sort of a larger metadata structure. So some of the really important information that we use to work with and manipulate that metadata, it becomes like a trimmed down version of one of these giant like schema objects, if that makes sense.
Just noting from the session chat that we have a gentle time warning. Shavi's talk begins at 3:45, so I guess we have some leeway there. I'm going to go ahead to Logan's question. Logan is saying that search results are a balance between providing enough information for readers to know if a topic is what they're looking for versus overwhelming them with information. So how did you determine what information to include in the search results?
That's an amazing question. I think that's something that we still think about like day to day. Definitely want to continue to shout out Taylor. The initially I was displaying like some descriptions and I even in the very alpha build was displaying context around where the search result was found in the document. That was way too much information, or sort of it didn't give the right information that we want to display. So Taylor going and writing all of those different taglines was this happy medium behind trying to dynamically create and serve information that would add context. I think also the addition to display types and to do a little bit of color coding, it was really like powerful. And the thing that probably remains my favorite thing is the graying out of outmoded docs. I think that's something that is extremely helpful for any user who is getting into the platform and might not understand it yet. Continually, it's also important to see like whether or not like the search results are successful and you're actually directing traffic to where it needs to go, which is something that we still are figuring out between like using Google Analytics and using Algolia's analytics, as well as using some of our own logging.
Very cool. Taylor has some additional comments. Just one more question from Susan. Are there any reference books or sites that you could recommend, maybe on the topic of search or anything else that comes to mind?
I don't know if I have any off the top of my head, actually. Definitely something I can think about and maybe get back to Susan with.
Maybe something we talk about in chat. My eyes got distracted as usual, but yeah, I guess at this point, I mean, I'll say thanks again for your awesome presentation. I think there was a glitch at some point, and we're sorry about that, but it was awesome. And thanks for being here for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.